Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to what I think is the greatest show on earth, the founding of the United States of America. Now, this lesson is not comprehensive. It's designed to be a big picture overview. As you see, I have here big picture overview, okay? So that's going to give you just a brief introduction into each of these key ideas, and in future lessons, I'll go into more specific detail about each of these things. But let me show you a little concept map I made here to give you a nice idea of what we're going to talk about in this lesson very briefly. So first off, we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, Shays Rebellion, the Constitutional Convention, the Ratification Debate, Washington's administration, Adams' administration, and the election of 1800. So hold on to your hats, and here we go. The publication of the Declaration of Independence represents the beginning of the United States of America. It's important to note that the Enlightenment was a real inspiration to our founding fathers. All of our founders, particularly Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, that they were children of the Enlightenment. And the motto of the Enlightenment was dare to know. They believed in human ability, human reason, using the scientific method to solve society's problems, and most importantly, that humanity could govern itself. We didn't need this top-down monarch telling us what to do, that we could self-govern, and that's very, very important to note. So on July 4th, 1776, we begin this great experiment for the world in self-government, and our purpose was to separate from Great Britain. We wanted to declare this not only to King George III, but also to the rest of the world that we were our own independent nation. And the key significance of this document is that it's the first political document of the United States. So we've declared our independence, we fought a war, and we won. Now what? Well, the first step is we need to develop a government structure for the United States. We need to figure out what our government is going to look like. And that was the purpose of the Articles of Confederation. The authors were the Continental Congress, and the date it was ratified was 1781, March 1st, 1781. The key significance of this document was not only that it was the first form of government in the United States, but it also passed the Northwest Ordinance. Coincidentally, this is the only useful thing it passed. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 laid out the procedure that all states had to follow in order to become states in the Union. In order to be accepted into the Union, you had to follow this specific procedure. And this is the procedure that is still on the books today. Every single state that has been admitted into the Union follows the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. But, as you can see in the chart over here on the bottom right, there were a lot of weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And a lot of those weaknesses will be the cause of our next topic, Shays Rebellion. Captain Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War soldier, actually led this rebellion, and it was a bunch of farmers that came together because they were sick to death of these high taxes that the government was charging them and the failure of the government to pay their Revolutionary War pensions. It was simply impossible for them to exist and to actually pay their debts. So a lot of them wound up losing their homes, and they even went to debtor's prison. They went to jail because they didn't have the money to pay their mortgages or the high taxes. These folks ended up traipsing around Massachusetts. They ended up shutting down courthouses so that people could not be sent to prison, and they stole weapons from local armories in order to fight back. The dates of this rather interesting rebellion were 1786 to 1787. It started in the fall of 1786 and ended in the winter of 1787 when it was finally put down because Daniel Shays was killed. But the major historical significance of this event is that it motivated the states to come together. And because of this event, because it scared everybody, because the founding fathers realized that people were upset and that we were about to lose the very fragile government we had just created, and that we needed to do something about it, we needed to handle it. And this event, it was so key in leading to the Constitutional Convention, which is our next topic of conversation. One of the interesting historical facts that I like to bring up whenever I talk about the Constitutional Convention is the fact that we romanticize our history. We kind of, as Americans, we picture this just, peace, love, and everybody's getting along, and we're all shaking hands, and it was very calm and subdued, and the government just kind of came together. That was not the case. There were very hot tempers in this room. Very few people agreed. It almost didn't happen. There were so many things that took place that we had to work out, that we had to discuss, just points of contention, that the Constitution almost didn't happen on so many different occasions. It's practically a miracle that it came together at all, but it did. So here we are. So the important items you need to remember about the Constitutional Convention are that it took place from May to September of 1787 in response to Shays Rebellion, as we just as we just talked about. And the historical significance, the key thing, it produced the United States Constitution. There are obviously other big, key, significant things that we could talk about, but big picture, because that's what this lesson is all about, big picture, is that it produced the United States Constitution, which is still our system of government today. Basic description, delegates from all states met to address the weaknesses in the articles. It is important to note that it didn't start out with people saying, oh yeah, let's just make a whole new form of government. The founders were split. Many wanted to just reform the Articles of Confederation just to fix the problems, but they didn't want to get rid of it. They didn't want a brand new system of government. But there was another set of folks at the convention that said we need to scrap the whole thing and we need a brand new constitution. So once our founders kind of agreed on certain things, then we could move on to the next stage, which was ratification, which is what we're going to talk about right now. All right, so if you thought the Constitutional Convention was intense, just wait for the ratification debate, because that was even more intense. Because now that we've got these bunch of guys in one room together that agreed, okay, let's put this Constitution out there and see if we can convince people to get behind it, now you've got to convince the rest of the country to get behind it. So that's an even more intense situation. The struggle was real, ladies and gentlemen. The struggle was real. So now we actually have the development of the very earliest political parties. You have Federalists that were pro-ratification and Anti-Federalists who were anti-ratification. We ended up being able to convince the Anti-Federalists to go along with it by including the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we now hold so dear would only be in existence, or would not be in existence, if it were not for the Anti-Federalists. And they were originally against ratification of the Constitution. And the Federalists, the folks that were all about it, that said we need to pass it now without delay, they were the Federalists, okay? And a few of them, got together and wrote the Federalist Papers. And you see there's a picture of it down here. And these were a series of essays written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton in an effort to convince folks to ratify the Constitution. Now, we look at these papers now, at least historians and legal scholars look at them as like these amazing, huge, important things, which they were. They were very, very important pieces of writing, but they only circulated in New York, which is interesting. You look back in history and you kind of assume that everybody read it. Not everybody read these particular essays. It was only in New York. But a lot of our court decisions and a lot of our legal precedent is in part based on these papers because they were written by our founders. But they're very, very important. So the ratification debate was very intense. It was ultimately successful because we did ratify the Constitution. But I wanted to introduce these key ideas to you. The idea of the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, concept of the Bill of Rights. They were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers and the authors of those papers. I'll talk about these in more detail in a later presentation. Now, the Washington administration, one could argue, was the most important because it was the first. If Washington didn't get it right, we wouldn't be here right now. There was a lot of pressure on this guy, so it's no wonder that he was a reluctant leader. He's like, I do not want this job. I am not about this. I just want to go back to Mount Vernon and hang out with Martha. I'm not about this. But they were like, listen, Washington, nobody else is going to be able to be elected. The only guy that everybody agrees on is you. So I'm sorry, but you just have to do it. He's like, oh, well, all right, I guess I'll do it. But his administration, although successful, was not without its challenges. He was a Federalist, so you see the beginnings of this political party development, and he was on one side of that. Under his administration, the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed, which is very important because it set up our court system. You have the Whiskey Rebellion, which was kind of an issue for him. I'll talk about that in a later presentation. The Genet Affair almost ended up being a disaster, but things died down because of the French Revolution. Jay's Treaty, which was very unpopular with Americans, and Pinckney's Treaty, which was very popular with Americans. Those topics will be addressed in a later presentation, but I wanted to introduce those concepts to you and let you know that these are very, very important key things about George Washington's administration that every history student should be aware of. John Adams, bless his heart, was not the greatest president we've ever seen. He did do some good things. He was an excellent statesman, very brilliant, but my lord, he was a train wreck as a politician. Massive problems here. He was not the most diplomatic guy, and he kind of tended to think that, well, my argument is good, so everyone will agree with me. Well, it's not really how it works. So he had some significant problems as president. One of the key problems he had was the XYZ affair, which I'll talk about in a later presentation. The Alien and Sedition Acts I'm going to discuss here a little bit because they're very, very important. John Adams actually suspended constitutional rights for folks because he wanted to get reelected in 1800. And so he actually retroactively removed people's citizenship, and he made it illegal to speak out against the government. So this was kind of a problem. The Federalists were starting to lose power, and the new party coming up, which was the party of Jefferson, the descendants of the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, those guys really did not like the idea of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions proposing that the Alien and Sedition Acts be removed, be repealed, and that the state shouldn't follow them at all. This created a lot of heated argument, and in the election of 1800, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of seconds, these are going to be major, those two events are going to be major issues with that election. But Adams really had a rough go of it. He was a Federalist, he was vice president under Washington, but Washington's success did not transfer to him. He was a one-term president, and it was a rough term. Just like I mentioned on the last slide, Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and with the ratification debate, you have the beginnings of political parties. Once the Constitution was ratified, the Anti-Federalists were no longer necessary because they were against ratification. Well, the Constitution was ratified, so now what happens? Well, we have in there to replace in the Democratic Republicans. These folks were all about limited government, very limited role. They didn't want a strong central government. They were all about states' rights. The Federalists, on the other hand, wanted a strong central government. They thought that the national government should be as involved as humanly possible, that they should be very involved. So this was really an election of one political philosophy against another, and it mirrors the debate that really was happening during the Constitutional Convention and even the ratification debate as well. Now, Jefferson ended up coming out on top. He won the election of 1800, so you have what makes this so significant, the first peaceful transfer of power. People were watching us. The entire world was watching us, wondering, well, hey, is this whole thing going to fall apart because now a different party is going to take over? Are the Federalists going to leave and allow the Democratic Republicans to take power? It wasn't quite as smooth as I might be making it sound. There were a couple bumps in that transition, but the fact was no blood was shed. There was no military, there was no army. The transfer of power did take place, and this proved to the world that it was possible to transfer power without this bloodshed, which up until recently, or up until this point, nobody thought that was possible. And if you know anything about the French Revolution, then you know that that didn't really work out too well. So it was very omnipresent in the minds of people of the world that transferring power from one ruling set of folks to another was going to be very, very difficult. But once this peaceful transfer of power happened, it proved that it was possible to do it. So our experiment in self-government was able to continue. Okay, so what did we learn? What did we learn? So we learned about the Declaration of Independence, and we learned that that was the first political document of the United States. We talked about the Articles of Confederation and mentioned that that was the first form of government of the United States, although it was very weak and it was ineffective. And that ineffectiveness really shines through with Shays Rebellion, which pointed out its weak points. And Shays Rebellion scared our founders so much that we ended up starting the Constitutional Convention so that we could figure out a new system of government that would work much better. And we produced the Constitution at that convention, and then, of course, we have to have the debate over whether or not we ratify it. And we talked about, with the ratification debate, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists won out, and we have the Constitution. Our first president, of course, was George Washington. He was a Federalist, and he was succeeded by John Adams, also a Federalist, but not very successful. He had some problems. And then we learned about the election of 1800, which was a very, very important election because it proved that the peaceful transfer of power was possible. And that's why it was such a watershed moment and so important to our country. So I hope this lesson made sense. I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you in the next video.